For decades, America has been on a low carb phase, and yet still Americans are getting bigger and heart disease is on the rise. So, where did we go wrong? We're trying to fix things with this new fat revolution and a ketogenic diet approach. But the question is, why doesn't fat and cholesterol in lead to fat on the outside and cholesterol in our blood vessels?
You cannot supplement your way to health, but there are things that we need to add to our lives that can maximize our pathway to wellness. The American diet is virtually devoid of omega 3 fatty acids, which play a major role in cardiovascular disease, gut permeability, and mental health. Personally, I take omega 3s every night, and iHerb is the best place for clean, natural sources of supplements. I love the ZenWise omega 3 fatty acid supplement, which is free of fish burps and good for the environment. Head on over to maximalbeing.com/iHerb, that's IHERB, and enter the code B as in boy, D as in dog, B as in boy, 5528 and receive 10% off your orders for all supplements. Maximize your supplements with iHerb.
So to unpack this myth today, joining me is Dr. Hattie Leisha, as well as Jackie, a good friend of mine in Philadelphia. As always, I am Doc Mock. I'm a therapeutic endoscopist. That's a GI doctor that specializes in cancer, pancreatic biliary disease, and I'm also a functional medicine practitioner. And joining me, as always, is Jackie.
Hello, everyone. I'm Jackie, and I just read everything Doc Mock sends to me. I'm not a practicing doctor or medical professional, but I like to read and I like to ask a lot of questions. So I'm going to keep them honest and make sure that there isn't too much jargon flying back and forth between these two geniuses. Dr. Leisha.
Hello, my name is Hadi Leisha. I'm an interventional cardiologist. I intervene on blood vessels in the heart and outside the heart. I'm originally Lebanese, hence the accent, but I trained in New Jersey with my good friends, and I'm currently practicing in Murfreesboro and Nashville, Tennessee. My background, why I'm interested in this side of medicine is my father is an integrative medicine specialist who had a eureka moment in the middle of his life and started exploring how to help people with chronic diseases that traditional medicine has completely not ignored, but just treated symptomatically. And I try to look outside the box and try to answer questions that are, causing the major health problems that we're facing these days. Back to you, Mark.
Yeah, thank you so much, Hattie. And, just to give you all a little backstory, when I was a resident back in beautiful New Jersey, Hattie was there in the cardiac care unit with me, putting those central lines in, swanning people. I learned vascular access from him. And he is just now a titan in the field. And so I figured who better to educate all of you?
Who better? I tried to make him a cardiologist. I failed miserably.
Us GI doctors were a little simpler, but
No way.
But anyway, I figured who better to educate all of you other than a vascular specialist. And so, our story begins back in the 1960s. There was this guy by the name of Dr. Ancel Keys. You may have heard of him at some point, in your reading of health literature. But he is the reason why America pioneered and started down the track of being on a low fat phase. And, he performed this study called the 7-Country Study, published in 1963, which basically demonized fat and cholesterol. And so that's when eggs came off the breakfast table and the breakfast cereal came in. He had the ear of our government. And, big grain came into the picture, fast forward 40, 50 years. And now we have about, 30 to 50% of our population is obese. So, the ketogenic diet is not a new thing, but it certainly is revitalized. And so I figured, with fat being so popular on our dinner tables now, why don't we unpack why fat on the dinner table doesn't lead to fat in those vessels? So Jackie, I'm going to turn it over to you to start the questions for Dr. Lisha.
So Dr. Lisha, I have a lot of questions. So, I read some information that Doc Mock sent over, and it was fat isn't the bad guy, basically, right? I grew up, as many folks did, saying, okay, fat in means fat out, right? If I'm eating a lot of fatty food, I'm going to gain weight, I'm going to have heart issues. But according to the research and, the myths being busted, that's not the case. So can you clarify, really, what that looks like? What's the difference between a good fat, a bad fat, and why that it can actually lead to a healthier heart?
Absolutely. So the first, example of, thinking about fats being really bad for you, think about the Italians and the Mediterraneans who are eating olive oil all day, every day, and they have the cleanest arteries, of course, if they don't smoke and not diabetic. So fat is not the bad guy, but of course, fat is not all in one basket. There's good fat and bad fat. To make it simple, basically, there are certain types of fat, like the fats that come from fish. Fat comes from olive oil, from tree nuts, that is very rich in omega-3 fatty acids. This is what our bloodstream loves. And these are the fats that bounce off our vascular cells without getting inflaming them. The bad fats are the fats that are saturated and the fats that are already modified and processed, and especially the fried fats, the fried oils that become completely unstable and go and scavenge every single cell that we have and induce inflammation everywhere. So fat in general is not the enemy. It is the bad fats. What we're talking about, fried foods, we're talking about processed food, we're talking about chips, and obviously, things that make sense. But there are fats that are amazing for your heart, like olive oil, like macadamias, like avocados, like fish. All these are actually make you live longer, better, and make you leaner, paradoxically so.
Yeah, Dr. Lisha alluded to, these societies that we have across the world that are called blue zones. And these are people that kind of go against traditional standard American, standard medical practices in terms of their diet, eating a high fat intake, but a lot of poly and mono unsaturated fats. And they live long and healthy lives. Now, as an aside, a lot of these people move a lot. They get 20,000 steps a day on average, regardless of their age, actually. And so, whether it's the movement, the food, it's probably, all of those things. But the blue zones, that's where this whole fat paradigm began to be unpacked again. You mentioned saturated fats, and, this is kind of a highly debatable topic. Are saturated fats all bad, or is just trans fats the enemy?
So the trans fat is the biggest enemy of all. If you want to really focus on one thing, it's the trans fats. Now, saturated fat, obviously, this is not conventional teaching, and these are, new literature that has come out in the last 15 to 20 years. Saturated fat in large quantities does induce plaque formation in the heart vessels and the rest of the body. But in reasonable amounts, especially if it's grass-fed beef or grass-fed pork, whatever, everything natural in small quantities is made, like, is eaten exactly the same way as it's made, as our good Lord has made it. That's the fat that is naturally healthy, and in small quantities, of course. If you're eating a steak every single day, that's not the best thing for you. But a grass-fed piece of meat once a week is actually okay. And it's way better than all the other fried foods and the trans fats that you see on the shelf that is quote unquote heart healthy.
I've got a question just to break it down. As I said, I'm going to keep you all honest here. So I'm deducing that saturated fat is just fat naturally occurring in a protein, right? So if I have a piece of beef, right, depending on the cut, there's fat in there. Is that like an example of saturated fat? Or is saturated fat in other places we find our food, right?
So saturated fat is mostly from animal products, but you can find it also in coconut, coconut milk, coconut oil. There are other plants that do have saturated fat, but the large majority of saturated fat is animal based
Okay.
and non-marine animal based most of the time.
Yeah, and the difference between that as opposed to what we deem the bad fats, the trans fats, is that when you're looking at the molecular structure, those of you that are watching this on YouTube, you can see that, like, doing your football end zone marker is a cis fat. That's a good fat. But when the markers twist this way and your hydrogen ions are on different sides of the goal post there, that's a bad fat. And also, our scientists have developed ways to jam hydrogen ions in the other seats in the fat car, hydrogenating them. So that's things like Crisco. Those things are even worse because they have been created, and they lead to free radical formation within your cells. So they damage your DNA. There also was a study that looked at people that had coconut oil every single day apart from their fat content. And those people did have higher rates of coronary artery disease over about a 10-year time span. But again, if you fit that into your normal macronutrient intake, coconut oils are actually fairly good for you. And I have it in my coffee almost every single day. So we talked about the fat in your food. Hattie, how does that fat in your food translate into cholesterol inside of your blood vessels, and how does that food get from your gut all the way into your blood vessel and clog up your heart?
And it's a GI doctor who's asking me, but I'm gonna do my best. Yeah, obviously the fats. So basically, we have what we call digestive enzymes. Whenever we ingest something, our digestive enzymes go to work, and they divide those food particles into smaller little particles that the cell can absorb, and through multiple processes that we're not going to go through. But they end up on the bloodstream side with small fat particles. Those particles are called chylomicrons. Chylomicrons means a big fatty bubble, basically, that has proteins in them and has fats and has cholesterol. Then there are multiple enzymes in the liver itself. So all these particles go into a vein called the portal vein into the liver, and the liver is the biggest industrial station of the body. This is where most chemical reactions happen. And the liver basically starts dividing up those chylomicrons into different particles. Some of them are called VLDL, which is very low density cholesterol, then lipoproteins, then you have the LDL, which are low density lipoproteins, and you have the HDL, which is the high density lipoproteins. All these, it's kind of alphabet soup, but let's kind of make it simple. HDL is the very, very good guy. You want to have a lot of HDL in your bloodstream. These are what we call literally the garbage collectors. These are the garbage trucks circulating in our body, collecting trash from everywhere and throwing it back to the liver. HDL. LDL is a low density lipoprotein. And when we say low, high, this is based on their weight on electrophoresis. It's a scientific way to differentiate between molecules. LDL is a type of cholesterol that in general can cause plaque formation, but putting it all in one category is not fair. There are different types of LDL. The LDL that comes from certain food sources can be big and fluffy LDL. These are the big particles that bounce around and don't get underneath the lining of the blood vessels. And there's the small and dense LDL. These are the nasty ones that come from Crisco, trans fats, fried food, all the processed food, and the hydrogenated oils that Doc Mark was talking about. So LDL in general is bad, but specifically small and dense LDL is the worst. And the more particles we have, the worse it is. The less particle, the better it is. And VLDL is a very low density lipoprotein, which is kind of the mother of some of those proteins that give rise to triglycerides and to cholesterol. What is triglycerides? It's a form of fat that is, it has a specific molecular structure that is described separately on your lipid profile. So whenever you get a lipid profile, a lipid panel, you have an LDL, HDL, and triglyceride in general. You want the triglyceride to be less than 150. You want the HDL to be in men more than 45 and women more than 55. And LDL, depending on the fact you have heart disease versus not, if you're diabetic versus not, the lower the better, basically. But long story short, the theory about cholesterol in the diet causing high LDL cholesterol in the blood is just too simple. It has been proven to be wrong for so long. And unfortunately, the entire Western world is paying the price for that.
You know, Dr. Lee, you brought up something that struck a chord in one of my memory. When I was about 24, I was following all the bro science. I was eating chicken breast, broccoli, and brown rice, working out all the time. I mean, I heard oatmeal's good for lowering your cholesterol. I thought cholesterol, period, was bad. I don't want it. So I was having oatmeal every morning, and I'm talking about for years, even to this day. And I went to the doctor, and doctor said, hey, your cholesterol is too low. And I thought, oh, well, thanks, doc. You know, I thought that was a, I was like, he was telling how healthy I was, but he said, no, you need cholesterol, and I never ate fish. I wasn't a big seafood, so I didn't have salmon or halibut. And he said, you need to have these in there. So can you just talk a little bit about like how important the good cholesterol is and how it protects your body, and make sure that, the bros like me out there who's just eating chicken and broccoli, are really have a big blind spot when it comes to our health and our, cardiovascular health.
Absolutely. So cholesterol is a major building block of our body. It's part of every single cell. You need cholesterol to function on daily basis. It's a major component of the cell, of the membrane of every cell, literally the barrier that keeps our cell healthy. It is also a major component of the major stress hormones that would allow us to survive and to make, like, for example, cortisone, some mineralocorticoid, which are specific hormones that allow for the metabolism of salt and potassium in the body. And it's a major building block of the brain and of the heart and the kidneys and some of the major organs in the body. Of course, the circulating cholesterol is different than the cholesterol that we have in our cells. And it is genetically predetermined how much of this cholesterol circulates in the bloodstream and how much inflammation one has based on genetic and environmental factors. And basically, cholesterol is not the enemy. It's the small and dense LDL, low density particle cholesterol that we want to try to minimize to lower possible. But HDL, you have people with total cholesterol more than 200 and an HDL of 80 or 90, high density cholesterol. That is not a bad thing. That's usually very much consistent with a heart healthy cardiovascular, with a healthy cardiovascular system. So in general, we cannot simplify things. It's way more complicated than that.
Yeah, it's interesting. If you look at the early literature on LDL cholesterol as kind of an endpoint, there was a 30% improvement in outcomes for people that have cardiovascular disease, where you're able to lower the LDL cholesterol. And then on the other end, in a lot of the studies, there was only a small fraction, less than 40% of patients that had an elevated LDL at the time of their myocardial infarction. So, it's interesting that our scientific community has kind of made it a linear relationship for so many years, and that people haven't let on to it being much more complicated, like you're expressing.
Absolutely. And I can tell you, I practice interventional cardiology. I literally intervene on people with heart attacks every single day. And I can't even tell you that I have hundreds of patients, hundreds, who have the most perfect LDL cholesterol that you can see. And they're still coming in with inflamed heart arteries, clots everywhere, where we have to stent and bypass and do things. So of course, LDL is a factor that leads to the development of plaque, but it needs the right environment, and it's not the only factor. It's one of the risk factors. People who just focus on that are just looking at basically tunnel vision. And we can talk about the risk factors and everything else, but it's not all about the LDL.
Yeah. So to that note, what are some additional things that people should be looking for, if it isn't just cholesterol and it isn't just numbers?
Perfect. So first of all, of course, smoking is even worse than LDL. It's those 7,000 chemicals circulating in your bloodstream cause so much inflammation and so much damage to the blood vessels that it's one of the major risk factors. Number two, diabetes. Diabetes is one of the most notorious diseases because it doesn't lead to symptoms until it's too late. And all the, what we call advanced glycated byproducts of diabetes, meaning the byproducts of the elevated sugars, go into those cells and start the process of inflammation and start the formation of the plaque. So diabetes, no good. Obviously the overweight status by itself, even if someone's exercising, has a higher inflammatory status and is a pretty complex metabolic picture and can lead to plaque formation. Of course, high blood pressure. So imagine having the most beautiful cholesterol lipid panel, but your vessels are being bombarded every day with pressure, pressure, and pressure. And when that happens, of course, the body's going to form a scar. It's going to defend itself. And this is the background of inflammation that leads to plaque formation. And of course, stress, psychological stress, and the fact that people are not, meditating enough or not spending enough time by themselves or kind of going back to themselves and being pushed around all the time through multiple complex mechanisms going from the brain, through the hormones, through the adrenal glands, can lead to worsening inflammation. And finally, this is like basically plaque formation is basically a recipe that has multiple risk factors associated with it. And to simplify it, it is mostly, if you divide up the major factors that lead to it, number one would be small and dense LDL cholesterol. Number two would be inflammation coming from lifestyle or other factors. Number three, blood sugars and the byproducts of those. And number four, free radicals that also combine with the inflammation pathway and lead to that. And the two other mechanisms are vasoconstriction, when the blood vessels start constricting, which leads to more inflammation. And finally, platelet activation. Platelets are small cells in our bloodstream that basically form clot. And the more they're activated, it's a kind of a vicious cycle of bad things happening. I know it's too complicated, but we can talk about each one in detail, but that's kind of the big picture.
I think you did a great job kind of breaking everything down into its component parts and just making people aware that there is so much more happening under the surface than just like cholesterol plopping its way on there. In
Yeah.
fact, you look at babies, unfortunately, they do have autopsy studies of babies, and even babies that, come out of the womb have plaque in their arteries, and they haven't eaten a single, bucket of Crisco or, Cheeto yet. So how do
Right.
they get the plaque? So that it's a much more complicated mechanism, like you were alluding to.
And the biggest message is also a lot of people blame it on family history. I see a lot of patients, oh, my dad, my father, my grandfather. That's true, but I can easily tell you that 70% of heart disease is at least environmental, at least acquired. Now, your dad having heart disease, of course, has to do with genetics, but your dad maybe lived an unhealthy life. You can't just, family history does not equal genetic predisposition. So genetic predisposition is also not one gene, multiple genes and the right environment. So people who feel doomed, I have a family history, whatever I do, it's going to happen to me. That's not right. You can reverse all of that.
So so what can we do to reverse that? What lifestyle interventions can we
Perfect.
follow to improve cardiovascular health?
So obviously, this will depend on, we have a tool in cardiovascular medicine to calculate the cardiovascular risk of every person based on their age, their weight, their blood pressure, blood sugar, and cholesterol levels and smoking status. Overall, it's a very quick app. You can actually find it anywhere. Based on that cardiovascular risk, we determine what's the most important step. But things that work for everybody, even people who do not have heart disease, who just want to start prevention, primordial prevention. So number one is obviously making sure that you're eating healthy. And what is eating healthy? The most recent data show that a Mediterranean type diet, rich with the full good fats of fish, tree nuts, um, uh, uh, all the Mediterranean type food, including even red wine, believe it or not, 1 or 2 glasses of red wine, obviously in moderation. Once you pass that, it's actually not good. A lot of green vegetables. These are powerhouses of not only micro and macronutrients, but anti-inflammatories. So diet is the core of lifestyle before you do anything else. Even if you exercise every single day at the gym, if you're eating processed food, that you're not really gonna protect yourself. Number two, exercise, aerobic exercise. You can do it the way you like. There are certain types of exercise that are not recommended from a cardiovascular disease, from a cardiovascular standpoint, like really super heavy chest press, a lot of heavy weight lifting that raises blood pressure a lot during these episodes. High intensity training, aerobic exercise is actually pretty healthy. There are a lot of things you can do, but most of the time, exercise is actually very good for you. Three is keeping a healthy weight. Of course, keeping what we call a body mass index less than 25 optimally, but reasonably less than 27, 28 would be okay, but 25 would be perfect. And of course, going to your doctor, checking your blood pressure, making sure your blood pressure, even in the healthiest people, is very, very unfair. You can have the healthiest people with high blood pressure and they deny it, and they're killing themselves, and oh, my blood pressure is so high, and they're physicians, they're healthy, they do everything, and they're still having high blood pressure. So if you don't fix that, you're going to end up in trouble. Getting a lipid panel once a year with your family doctor and analyzing this depending on your cardiovascular risk, if you need a medication versus not. Um, and of course, making sure your blood sugars are within good control. And finally, trying to stay away from stress. I know this is a conceptual, theoretical, impossible in 2021, but the least possible, as much time as you can get to for yourself, to take care of yourself. and to try to kind of detoxify all the bad stuff going on around us. So basically, this is a recipe for a long, happy life, not only from a cardiovascular standpoint, but from a cancer standpoint, GI standpoint, you name it. Every single organ in the body would benefit from that.
That's a pretty good point. It seems, as the more you talk about the things that are good for you, it's, the human body is like a system, right? And so if one system starts to fail, the other systems that are connected to it start to fail as well. So it's like, if you focus and really be mindful on, okay, let's start being heart healthy, right? Just through collateral, you're gonna make everything else on the right path, because looking at these things, it would be something that, Doc Mok would say, right, with gut health, right? Be healthy, eat well, exercise, take care of yourself mentally. So that's really great. I have one quick question before going to break.
Sure.
Cereal, right? You see it all the time. You say, hey, special, I don't want to say any brands, but this special brand of cereal is to help your heart. It's heart healthy. These grains are good for you. you know, are there cereals out there, or is there something we should look for? Should we avoid it? What's your view on there?
And first of all, in all fairness, I'm not a nutritionist, I'm not a dietitian, I'm a heart doctor, but of course, I read the literature, and, with my bias and my background, I personally, and this is not a recommendation, I'm completely against cereal, because when did we start eating cereal? Probably 50 years ago, right? Like, when all this, what Doc Mok was talking about with Ansel Keys and the alternatives and all the food incentives for corn and the government contracts and the massive production of all of that. Obviously, all of this is controversial, but aside from the political side, from a pure medical side, it's concentrated sugars, concentrated carbohydrates that are not eaten in the natural state, that you are trying to eat in literally 2 minutes, and your body is just overwhelmed with it. The insulin spike is unbelievably high. Now, you can find some cereals that do not have sugar and have oatmeal and more fibers, but in general, I do not think it's a natural way to eat, and I do not recommend it for my patients. If someone enjoys it once in a while, everything in moderation, that's fine, but every single day having it at breakfast, I would not recommend it. But that's personal, and I cannot make this as a recommendation. We'll see what Doc Mok thinks.
Yeah, I 100% agree. From a GI perspective, about 80% of our population is gluten sensitive, whether it be a diagnosable, westernized medical condition like celiac disease, or whether it be non-celiac gluten sensitivity. Just the wheat that we cultivate is a strain called dwarf wheat, and dwarf wheat is a strain that which our body cannot physically recognize the gluten protein as something that is natural, and therefore we mount an immune reaction. And as we discussed in our little talk on atherogenesis, inflammation is central to the development of plaques in our heart. And so if we're creating inflammation in our gut, that inflammation doesn't just stay in your intestine, it's going to get out to different places too, and it's going to lead to development of atherogenesis. And then also, if you eat fat while you're, burning fat all night, you're going to continue to burn fat during the day. But if you add in carbs, you switch over to your carb mechanism, your fat stays where it is. And so that belly fat you have, it's going to stay put. So back to you. Yeah. Back to you, Jackie.
Well, that's a tough message for me I used to be a very huge cereal enthusiast, as Doc Mok may know, but I've since gotten off the processed stuff. So, I'm 60 days clean now, so I'm getting my chip soon. Very proud of myself. But no, we're going to take a quick break. We're here with Dr. Lisha and Doc Mok and Jackie P, the layman, and we'll be back shortly after this message.
What's going on, Maximal Beings? It's Doc Mok here. Many of you are returning to the gym now, but some are not going back. Regardless of what you plan, Rogue has got the right gear to fit your needs. I personally own a barbell set and love it. The Black Ops shorts are sweat resistant and flexible for getting deep in your squats. Head on over to maximalbeing.com/rogue for our referral link. Order 3 items and they ship for free. And as usual, it's Doc Mock, and I'm here to maximize your pathway to wellness. If you're stuck at home and cannot make it to the grocery store, delivery may be the best way to stay clean and healthy. Instacart is the national leader in the direct-to-home delivery service. With numerous major chains and food from smaller stores, you can get those local veggies sent directly to your doorstep. Head on over to maximalbeing.com/Instacart and maximize your nutrition today.
And we're back. So, coming back from the break, just to summarize, we've gone through the whole process of cholesterol, lipids. We've talked about formation of plaques in the heart. This is where Dr. Lisha comes in and saves your life in the middle of the night, as I've seen him do time and time again, standing there at the bedside. But we're going to just dive a little bit deeper into the super nerdy science, into 2 molecules called uncoupling proteins and PPARs. So PPAR has kind of 2 flavors to it, PPAR alpha and PPAR gamma. PPAR alpha and gamma are fairly new compounds. They're found in the 1990s, and PPAR alpha has been found to actually elevate your good cholesterol levels. So there's potential to clear lipids from the blood. Now, PPAR gamma can increase insulin sensitivity and therefore lower blood glucose. And as we discussed in the first segment, both of those things would be really valuable to improving cardiovascular disease. So, Dr. Lisha, it's all well and good. We found these PPARs in the lab and rats and things like that. But how does that translate into clinical practice? And, do the medications that we create against these, do they actually work for heart disease?
Let me make it simple as we can. I think to translate this to real life, the way this can be conceptualized is all through one central big mechanism called insulin resistance. Insulin resistance is the mother of most of the modern world diseases. Every single organ in the body gets affected by it. And I don't mean diabetes. I'm talking about insulin resistance, that major hormone that regulates blood sugar and is connected to inflammation, metabolism, vasoconstriction, vasodilatation, clot formation. So all the mechanisms that lead to insulin resistance lead to cardiovascular disease, dementia, macular degeneration of the eye, chronic kidney problems, a fatty liver, NASH, non-alcoholic steatohepatitis, and all the skin conditions related to today's diet. But basically, how does the body become insulin resistant? Is when you overwhelm it with so much carbohydrates, and I'm talking about the processed carbohydrate, not the slow release carbohydrates that you find in green vegetables and some of the low glycemic fruits, fruits with low glycemic index. When the body reacts so highly with such a spike of insulin, then over time, we get overwhelmed. We store and we store and we store all these carbohydrates in the form of fats to a point where we cannot store anymore. And basically, this is where problems start to happen. And this is linked to inflammation, free radical. All of these are interconnected mechanisms. But to link it to a layperson's understanding, it's all about insulin resistance. And how do we decrease insulin resistance? Meaning how we make our bodies more responsive to insulin is by exercising. You open up the floodgates of all these transporters that go onto the muscle cells that transport the glucose back into the cell so it can do its job. And by eating healthy, by minimizing direct carbohydrates and sugars and processed food, by stressing less, by maintaining a healthy weight, by just avoiding all the toxic materials and the pollution around us. So, long story short, insulin resistance is the center of the Western syndrome, like I call it.
Yeah, and it turns out that when we try to block these PPARs in the lab, it doesn't necessarily correlate to improvements in the health of our heart. And the reason being, there are genetic differences and there are differences in the way our genes get expressed. And I think the best example of this for all of you out there, given the fact that it's a new year that have started on keto, you've already lost 5-10 pounds. You've lost your water weight from the glycogen stores, right? Now it's time for you to actually start losing fat, and you don't make it. And you think, oh my God, I'm a failure. I didn't lower my carbs enough, something like that, assuming you're doing clean keto. But actually, some of you may have PPAR gamma deficiency, and that's a fairly common genetic problem that people have. And the fact is that we put people on these fad diets, and a lot of people fail. And it's due to these small differences in your genetics and the way those genes are made and expressed in our body that lead to differences in the diet. So that's why you need somebody that knows what they're talking about, that can work with you through these nuances and create a plan that's right for you as an individual. Now, Jackie, you were uncoupling a little bit this weekend, and it's not what you think, listeners, okay? It's not what you think. But Jackie, what do I mean by that? What were you uncoupling this weekend?
So, I, per Doc Mock, read a little bit about, how do I say
thermogenesis? Yeah.
Thermogenesis.
Yep.
And how, exercising in the cold, right, that makes your muscles shiver, can actually help to, that actually has a lot of benefits. So, I'm Haitian, I'm Caribbean, I'm born and raised South Florida. So I'm a tropical person down to my soul. So I like to be warmer. However, I've been introducing a little bit of cold into my life. So what that looks like is, go outside, do some jump rope in the cold, not too long. I'm a tropical person. So, but just in little bits, because the benefits, right, for the PPARs and the uncoupling, the UCPs, right, alphabet soup, have, there's just health benefits. So that's what I've been introducing to my health and fitness regimen to, help just be more maximal and, and be healthier. You can explain that a little bit better than I can, what the uncoupling and how that works, but just be cold. If you're in the Northeast, go and be cold a little bit.
No, I can't say it even more eloquently than that. Uncoupling proteins are activated. There are these compounds, again, recently discovered. And one uncoupling protein number 2 can lower your blood glucose. Uncoupling protein number 1 can lower plaques inside of your arteries. And uncoupling protein number 3 can actually get rid of the gunk in your cells and your mitochondria, the powerhouses that can damage your powerhouses and make it inefficient, called free radicals. And so things like cold thermogenesis, when you're from, South Florida and you're standing out in Philadelphia cold weather, you're uncoupling just by standing outside, maybe shivering a little bit. Menthol topical lotion on the part of your body that you're trying to uncouple actually does have some benefit for activating the same uncoupling proteins that cold thermogenesis does. Taking a cold shower for 30 seconds on and then going back to that nice comfy warm, or even just driving to work without a jacket or without your heat blasting and having a jacket on, each little step will get you some degree of uncoupling. And then also intermittent fasting, which, we had a great guest on our podcast there in Philadelphia. I think Jackie has a few questions as we're wrapping up here for Dr. Lisha.
I do.
Before we get there, it's something that you guys just talked about, the intermittent fasting. That's one major way of also decreasing insulin resistance. by allowing the body to use your own fats and going through the mechanisms. But there's a recent study published in a traditional American College of Cardiology journal that combined intermittent fasting with Mediterranean diet. That combination of fasting then eating Mediterranean has been the most powerful lifestyle intervention for decreasing cardiovascular disease. So it's pretty powerful. So skipping a meal, it is traditionally frowned upon, but we're finding out more and more that this lines up with our ancestors millions of years ago, who did not have fridges everywhere and used to feast and then go fast for a few days and then feast and fast. So that is not really a bad thing for the body. And combining exercise with intermittent fasting and this lifestyle is something that's also super healthy and minimizes inflammation, cancer predisposition, all the modern diseases.
Interesting. So all those movie montage of these guys training in the cold, right? I guess they were on to something. They weren't just making cool 1980s action sequences. That's good to know. That's good. That's how I feel anyway when I'm out in the cold doing jump rope. I don't know if that's how I look.
I've seen him.
That's how I feel. But I did have a couple questions, Dr. Lisha, and these are just for folks out there who are listening to this who maybe this is the first time they're listening, and if you think about all the changes in all this, it can be overwhelming, right? So like I would love to just know a couple things, like just simple, right? What is your favorite exercise, right? That's something that you do, maybe if you're alone on time, just something that you say, hey, this is something I can do. I love it. Yeah. It helps me, helps the heart. What would you say is your favorite?
I got, brands put apart, but I got addicted to Peloton. It's unbelievable. The convenience, all the programs that they do, the instructors that are extremely smart. So cycling is my favorite. It used to be running, but with all the, wear and tear and all the stuff that we do to our bodies, I found it a little bit less stressful. And it's you can choose whatever stage you want to do. You can go high intensity. So that's the flexibility that I like about, and you can fit it anytime throughout the day.
Okay. I cycle myself, no big deal. So speaking of, the ketogenic diet, right? Remember the Atkins back in the day? It might still be around, right? What is the craziest diet that you've either tried or heard of?
I've always been a Mediterranean type person. I'm originally Mediterranean. I'm Lebanese, so I grew up in that kind of diet. I've always enjoyed it, and I've seen people around me eat it all day, every day, and not gain weight with lots of healthy fats. But in terms of craziest diet, there are some people who take ketogenic diet to an extreme where everything is processed, everything is boxed and packaged and all of that. It's just not right, and it's not sustainable, and you're introducing tons of chemicals with that. If you can do ketogenic diet and you like it, do it naturally. So I wouldn't say it's the craziest diet, but I just cringe whenever I see people just with bars and they're having, it's not natural, it's not sustainable, and it's going to cause a problem at some point.
So they took it to the extreme, like they took a good idea and then they went all the way to the.
It's the processing part too,
Dirty keto.
Yeah. Someone just like eating coconut oil, without anything else. I mean, some people take it to an extreme. You can't do that. Just
block of cheese
in moderation. That's right.
Every meal, just a block of cheese.
Okay, that's good to know. And what would you say is your this is a two-part question. What's your favorite health book?
Like, he started to interrupt you, but he said black and cheese. That made something come to my mind. So the Europeans, you know, they're extremely proud of their cheeses, especially the Western Europeans, and they did their best to confirm that this, you know, dairy by itself is not directly associated with cardiovascular disease. There are a lot of recent trials that were published and presented at major conferences in the European and American meetings that show that there are some proteins within cheeses that have a lot of saturated fat that prevent, those proteins prevent the absorption of the fat in a way that doesn't lead to inflammation and significant elevation of the small and dense LDL particles. So there are certain types of cheeses. You see the French eat tons of cheese, the Italians, the Danish, the Scandinavian. Obviously, everything in moderation. If you eat a lot, you're going to end up in trouble. But a small amount is actually relatively okay, because the nature has made it in a way where there's a protein that avoids the absorption of certain types of nasty fats that cause damage and inflammation.
That's interesting.
Might I also just add, before we get to our last question, that our cows are different in Europe and America.
That's
the
right.
cows here, not only are they A1 versus A2, but you know, the ones with the spots versus the brown cows,
right?
The ones that make more lactose. But also our cows are fed grain, and
exactly.
So the dairy products that we're eating have the grain, and we already talked about what grain does. So
absolutely.
Back to you, Jackie.
American cows. Okay, and so there's a two-part question. One would be for your personally, and maybe one to start off for someone who's maybe dipping their toe into being more conscious with their health. So the first question is, what's your favorite health book and why? And the follow-up question, and it's maybe the same answer, you know, if someone walked off, you know, the street and said, hey, listen, I just want to start making changes and start the path, right? You know, it may not be all in one lump sum change, but just start paying more attention, being conscious. What would you say would be a good book or resource for that person as well?
This is obviously outside my, you know, kind of specialty in what I do and, you know, the pure interventional cardiology part. But the most fascinating book I've read recently is The Plant Paradox by Stephen Gundry. I know he's very famous on YouTube and all of that, but he deserves it. He's a cardiovascular surgeon who has done hundreds, if not thousands, of operations, has seen heart disease, and has been very, very mindful of the relationship between nutrition and cardiovascular disease, and has that theory of lectin. And I'd like to see what Doc Mok thinks about that those certain proteins that induce inflammation and the immune system in our gut and cause leaky gut syndrome, which starts the mechanism of bad health. So, of course, nobody has the whole truth, and all of us have parts of the truth, but I think he is close to kind of getting to the mechanism of leaky gut syndrome, which is the basis of our health. If someone has a good gut and basically doing everything that we discussed, usually they're in extremely good health. And the plant paradox with the theory of lectin has been extremely fascinating to me, especially from someone who has the same background as I am. So I highly recommend it.
Yeah, that man, you know, was a cardiothoracic surgeon and left the knife behind to start a functional medicine practice. And, you know, I think the case in point to do lectins do harm on your gut is, you know, eat a meal of just all beans and see how you feel, you know, during and after, see how your spouse feels during and after. And case in point, you know, lectins are not great for your gut, but they're also, I really think his argument about certain plants being harmful is a really fascinating one. And I think it just alludes to why we need to eat local, right? You need to, if tomatoes are not in season right now, so eating tomatoes that aren't canned or preserved is not good for your body because they've been flown from somewhere else and they've just gathered a bunch of harmful compounds. So
Right.
love that book.
Absolutely.
Back to you, Jack. And then Jackie also asked what, you know, if you were coming off the street and I said, you know, what was the one thing that I could do to improve my health? You know, what would it be?
One thing?
Yeah.
Obviously avoid, you know, sodas. That would be like one major intervention. And if you don't like sodas, just trying to eat natural as you can. A big bowl of salad every day. And even if you don't exercise, even if you don't have the time, things are going to add up in your life where you're going to get there. But if you have to intervene somewhere, start with diet. Diet is the core of good health. And you can, again, of course, exercise, we love it, but you can exercise a lot and still be unhealthy. So diet is the core of good health. That's what I would say.
Jackie, do you just want to summarize what we learned today and then we'll wrap up?
Yes. I feel like I'm about to do a presentation, a book report, summarize. Yeah. So I think there's just not a lineal connection with fat in bad health. I think based off advertising, right, from food brands and, you know, just, I guess, bad research in the past, you know, me specifically as well has been guilty of just thinking, okay, this food is low fat, right? You know, this packaging, it says, oh, it's low fat, that means it's healthier, but it's not that simple. You know, there's good fats, right, that come from good sources like, you know, seafood, your salmon, or, you know, tree nuts, right, avocado. And these are important because they contribute to a healthy heart, and your heart keeps you going. So you got to make sure you have a healthy heart. And there's no such thing as just bad cholesterol, right? There's cholesterol that helps, and we're made of cholesterol. So it's important to distinguish, you know, what is good and what is bad. And really, if I were to sum it all up, it's eat something that's closest to what it looked like when it came out of the ground.
100%.
If it's in a box, if it has to last long, that means there's something in there that didn't come out of the ground. And if you can exercise and move around a bit, that helps as well. And if you can do it in the winter and make a cool montage, that'll also help and help you look cool on Instagram. But it's really just being mindful of what you eat, you know, paying attention to where the food is coming from. I have been trying myself, Doc Mock, to eat locally, right? But being in the Northeast is a little bit more difficult, but it can be done. And also be happy.
Yep.
You know, we have a choice every day to wake up and put a smile on or put on a frown. And studies show that put a smile on actually helps. So keep, you know, stay on top of those things, and, you know, you'll start getting in better shape and feeling better and being a better you.
That's a great, you know, thing. And obviously that's a whole topic on its own, you know, mental health and happiness, and is so important. And I have hundreds of examples of patients who have made it through the most difficult times. But one last note on my end is I don't blame people for eating what they're eating. And of course, everybody has their choice in actively seeking good food. But you go to airports and you walk through food, you know, so there's a food desert out there. There's not even one choice in an entire airport that you can eat that's healthy for you unless you brought it yourself. So I really hope some genius entrepreneur who has this background in health, maybe Doc Mock can do that. So kind of start a fast food chain. Yes, you heard me right. Fast food chain. You can do fast food in a super healthy way that your body would love, that keeps you in shape, keeps you sharp, no mental fog, no heart disease, no dementia, no fatty liver, and keeps you in shape. It is doable. And unfortunately, the food industry follows the people, and the people follow the food industry. It's like that vicious cycle of bad things. I wish we can break that by showing that you can make a huge business out of heart healthy fast food. And I hope it happens in my lifetime.
So this has been an amazing chat. I'd like to again thank Jackie P, good friend, fasting ninja, hilarious guy that's managing everybody's money, and
Stop it.
Hattie Alicia, who is fixing blood vessels, coming in the middle of the night to save lives, and who has taught me so much over the years. I'd like to thank all of you out there for your community, and again, I just think we have such wonderful and supportive people here at Maximal Being. And so without further ado, I'm Doc Mok here with Jackie P and Dr. Hattie Alicia, and we are here to maximize your pathway to wellness.
What's going on, Maximal Beings? Doc Mok here. If you haven't done so already, leave us a comment and hit the subscribe button. Let your friends and family know. That way we can get the word out and continue to bash the bro science.